I used to think my life was ordinary, even enviable. I woke up every morning beside Claire, the woman everyone in town admired. She had a way of moving through the world that made people turn their heads, not because of her beauty alone, but because of her composure. Elegant, refined, endlessly patient. At least that's what others saw. From the outside, we were the picture of stability. A neat 2-story house on a quiet street, matching smiles at neighborhood gatherings, and a marriage that people described as perfect. Friends would tease me, calling me lucky. My coworkers would nudge me during lunch breaks and say they envied me. I laughed along, but deep inside I never fully believed them. Perfection has a way of feeling staged. I tried to dismiss those thoughts, convincing myself they were born from insecurity. Claire was always composed, always polished, as if she had been rehearsing her lines long before anyone asked her to speak. I adored her, yet sometimes I caught myself studying her face too closely, wondering if the smile she gave me was truly hers or just another performance. In quieter moments, when it was just the two of us, I'd search for something raw, anger, sadness, joy that wasn't curated. But she rarely slipped. If she did, it was fleeting, a shadow across her eyes when I asked too many questions, or the tightening of her jaw when I mentioned wanting children. It would pass quickly, replaced by her practiced calm, and I'd be left questioning if I'd imagined it at all. We had a routine. Coffee at 7, her run at 8, dinner precisely at 6. The kind of rhythm most couples crave. But routine can hide cracks, and over time I noticed details that didn't align. A phone call she took in another room. A late return from her jog, perfume lingering faintly on her coat when she swore she hadn't gone anywhere but the grocery store. Whenever I asked, she had explanations ready. Smooth, logical, and delivered with such certainty that I felt guilty for doubting her. She'd touch my hand and laugh, reminding me that suspicion had no place in a marriage like ours. I'd force myself to believe her. After all, wasn't that what love was? Trust, even when doubt whispered in the corners of your mind. But sometimes, in the silence of our bedroom, staring at the ceiling while she breathed steadily beside me, I felt a gnawing sense of unease. It was like being in a play where everyone else had memorized the script, but I was improvising my lines. Something about Claire's perfection didn't feel real. Still, I convinced myself we were happy. That we were the kind of couple people envied for a reason. I didn't know then that the cracks I saw were not illusions. They were warning signs. And soon her polished perfection would shatter into pieces I could never put back together. The morning it all began seemed like any other. Coffee at 7. Her run at 8. But that run, she never returned. When Claire didn't return from her morning jog, I told myself she must have stopped to chat with a neighbor or lingered at the cafe down the street. She had her routines, but sometimes she liked to wander. I tried to brush off the unease, sipping my coffee while the clock ticked louder than usual. By 9:30, my patience turned into worry. By 10, I was pacing the kitchen. She never ignored her phone, yet my calls went straight to voicemail. The pit in my stomach deepened. I walked to the front window, scanning the street for her familiar figure, willing her to appear. She didn't. I got in the car, retracing her usual path. The park, the corner store, the back roads she sometimes used. Nothing. I even asked a few strangers if they'd seen a woman matching her description. Tall, brunette, elegant stride. Their blank stares offered nothing but dread. By noon, I called the police. My voice shook as I explained that my wife hadn't come home. The dispatcher's tone was calm, measured, like she'd heard it 100 times before. "It's only been a few hours, sir. Adults have the right to disappear, but this wasn't Claire. She thrived on predictability. She lived for order. For her to vanish without a word, it wasn't just unusual, it was unthinkable. When officers arrived later that afternoon, they moved through the house with clinical precision. One of them, a younger detective with sharp eyes, lingered on details I never considered. A half-folded sweater on the couch, dishes neatly stacked, her running shoes missing. He scribbled in his notebook, occasionally glancing at me as though I'd said something wrong. By evening, neighbors gathered outside. Some offered comfort, others whispered. Their eyes carried unspoken questions. What really happened? The search escalated quickly. Dogs sniffed the trails she frequented. Officers combed through wooded areas. their flashlights cutting across the darkness. I stood among them, heart pounding, feeling like a shadow in my own life. Each hour that passed made her absence heavier, more final. Then came the moment that changed everything. One officer approached holding a small evidence bag. Inside was a blood-stained scarf, one I recognized instantly. It was Claire's. My breath caught. "Where did you find that?" I asked, but my voice cracked. "In your garage," the detective replied flatly. The word struck me harder than any physical blow. My garage? Impossible. I hadn't seen that scarf in weeks. Yet there it was, tainted and damning. I felt the weight of every stare shift toward me. The search for my wife blurred into an investigation of me. Questions became sharper, colder. My every word was dissected, my every movement scrutinized, and for the first time, a terrible thought pierced my panic. This wasn't just about her disappearance anymore. Someone wanted me to take the fall. As the sun set, the house no longer felt like my home. It felt like a crime scene, and I could feel suspicion settling over me like chains I couldn't escape. The blood-stained scarf wasn't the only thing they claimed to find. A smear on the garage floor, tiny but undeniable, was swabbed and bagged as though it were a signature written in red. The detective told me it was Claire's blood. I swore I'd never seen it before, that someone had planted it, but my protests sounded thin even to my own ears. By the next morning, word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Whispers traveled faster than facts. Neighbors who once smiled at me over hedges now avoided my gaze, and those who did speak remembered things, selective things. A slammed door at midnight, raised voices on the porch, a shadow of an argument they couldn't quite place. None of it was enough on its own, but together it painted a picture I barely recognized. When the detectives returned, their questions had changed. They no longer asked what happened to your wife. Instead, they asked, why would you hurt her? I tried to explain how much I loved her, how our lives were carefully woven together, how I couldn't imagine a world without her. But love, in their eyes, had already curdled into motive. The arrest came suddenly, cold handcuffs biting into my wrists, the metallic click echoing in my ears. The walk to the patrol car felt endless. Neighbors staring from behind curtains, some openly watching from their lawns. To them, I wasn't a man in mourning. I was the monster who had killed his wife. In the holding cell, reality sank in like a slow poison. They believed I had murdered Claire, and worse, her family did too. When they appeared at the preliminary hearing, their grief twisted into fury. Her sister glared at me as though she could burn a hole through my skin. Her father, once warm and welcoming, refused to even look at me. When he finally spoke, his words cut sharper than any blade. He pretended to love her. But we all saw how controlling he was. My daughter deserved better. I wanted to scream, to tell them they were wrong, that I would have laid down my life for Claire. But every plea felt useless against their conviction. Betrayal seeped deeper than the accusation. It was as though I had lost my wife twice. Once to her disappearance and again to the narrative that now defined me. The trial loomed ahead. A storm I couldn't outrun. Prosecutors promised evidence, motive, and witnesses. My lawyer urged me to stay calm, but I could see doubt even in his eyes. Doubt was everywhere now, filling the courtroom, settling over every whispered conversation. Each day that passed chipped away at the life I thought I knew. I was no longer the quiet man with the perfect marriage. I was a headline waiting to be written, a villain waiting for his sentence, and deep down I feared the outcome. Because innocence means nothing when the world is determined to see you guilty. The courtroom smelled of old wood and dust, a place heavy with history and judgment. I sat at the defense table, hands clenched, staring at the jurors as though I could will them to see me as I was, a husband, not a killer. But every glance I caught carried suspicion, as though my guilt was already decided. The prosecution moved with precision. They painted me as a jealous, controlling man, whose perfect marriage was nothing more than a facade. They spoke of arguments overheard by neighbors, of the blood in the garage, of the scarf stained and abandoned like a clue in a play staged for the jury. They made Claire into a victim, silenced forever by the man who vowed to protect her. Each time they twisted my life into a weapon, I fought back with memories. I remembered our laughter at the dinner table, the way she leaned into me when she was tired, the quiet intimacy of two people who had once trusted each other completely. But those memories weren't evidence. They were fragile ghosts, powerless against the weight of photographs, testimonies, and forensic claims. Her family sat only a few feet away, their grief sharpened into anger. I wanted to stand and shout that I hadn't done it, that I loved her more than life itself, but every time I spoke, the prosecutor turned my words into proof of obsession. Love became motive, devotion became control, silence became guilt. I watched as my lawyer tried to counter, but even he seemed to stumble under the tide of damning evidence. The scarf, the blood, the testimony of a neighbor who swore she heard a woman screaming one night. None of it was conclusive, but together it was enough to drown me. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, I searched their faces for mercy. There was none. Guilty, the foreman announced. The word echoed in my skull, hollow and final. My legs felt weak, my chest caved in. I wanted to cry out, but no sound came. I looked toward her family, hoping for one last flicker of doubt, one sign they still believed me. Instead, I saw only relief, as though justice had been served. The judge's sentence fell like a hammer. 22 years. 22 years for a murder that never happened. 22 years stolen from me for a crime I didn't commit. As guards led me away, I thought of Claire. Where was she? Was she buried somewhere, as they believed? Or was she alive, watching from the shadows, letting me rot in her place? The cell door slammed behind me, sealing my fate. And in the suffocating silence of prison, one thought repeated like a heartbeat. If I ever walked free again, I would uncover the truth. The first night in prison was the longest of my life. The clang of the bars, the smell of sweat and metal, the echo of voices down the corridor, it all pressed against me like a weight I couldn't escape. My sentence wasn't just 22 years. It was a lifetime carved into pieces, measured by steel doors and the sound of footsteps approaching. Days bled into weeks, weeks into years. Time became slippery, as though the clocks inside the prison ticked differently than those in the outside world. I learned quickly that survival meant adaptation. Keep your head down. Don't ask questions. Don't show weakness. Still, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't erase the label stamped onto me. Wife killer. Some inmates kept their distance. Others circled, curious, testing me. In the cafeteria, one man leaned close and whispered, "What's it like taking out your old lady?" His grin was sharp, cruel. I didn't answer, but inside I burned. I wanted to scream that I hadn't done it, that Claire was out there somewhere. But in prison, the truth is currency no one spends. At night, lying on a thin mattress, I replayed my marriage in fragments. Her smile when she poured my coffee, the way her hand lingered on my arm at parties, and then darker moments, the arguments that neighbors claimed to hear, her sudden silences, the way she seemed to vanish into herself whenever I asked about her past. I began to wonder if I had ever truly known the woman I loved, or if she had been a stranger wearing my wife's face. Some inmates shared their own stories with me, each one a mirror I didn't want to look into. One man confessed to stabbing his girlfriend in a jealous rage. Another claimed he'd been framed by his lover after catching her cheating. Their words clung to me, echoes of betrayal that made my own story feel less unique yet no less horrifying. I saw myself in their eyes whether I wanted to or not, but through it all one thought anchored me. Claire wasn't gone. I couldn't explain it. Call it instinct, call it denial, but deep in my chest I felt it. She was alive. Somewhere she was living a life while I wasted away in a cage. The idea kept me breathing when despair threatened to choke me. I counted the years not by seasons but by losses. Friends who stopped visiting. Letters that stopped arriving. The outside world moved on, forgetting me, burying me under its progress. I became a ghost long before my time was served. Yet even as the prison walls closed in, I held on to a single promise. If I ever walked out of those gates, I would find her. And I would demand the truth. I had learned to numb myself to prison gossip. Most stories were recycled lies, designed to pass the time or break the spirit. But the day I overheard two guards talking, something in my chest stirred for the first time in years. "Looks just like her," one of them said casually, unaware I was listening. Different state, new name. Could be coincidence, but still, My fork froze halfway to my mouth. My wife. Her image, her scent, her voice, all of it surged back with violent clarity. I wanted to dismiss it as another cruel rumor, yet the whisper clung to me like smoke I couldn't wave away. That night I lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling. Could she truly be alive? Had she staged everything, leaving me to rot while she built a new life? The thought was a dagger, equal parts hope and betrayal. Days blurred again, but the whispers multiplied. An inmate from the Midwest claimed he'd seen her at a diner. A prison chaplain mentioned hearing a strange tip during a sermon. Even the guards seemed to look at me differently, as if weighing whether to tell me more. I didn't know what to believe. Grief plays tricks. Sometimes I convinced myself she'd walk into the visiting room any day, laughing at the madness of it all. Other times I swore the system had hollowed out my mind, and I was conjuring ghosts to stay sane. I tried writing to her parents, desperate for clarity, but their silence was louder than any denial. Their eyes during the trial flashed in my memory, accusatory, certain. Would they admit it if she were alive, or had they helped bury the truth? Nights stretched long, haunted by echoes of her footsteps, the way she'd tie her running shoes before a jog, the same jog that became my life sentence. One question tormented me. If she was alive, why had she never reached out? Was she afraid? Or had she wanted this outcome all along? As the years inched closer to my release date, hope and paranoia wrestled inside me. I no longer feared prison. I feared freedom, because freedom meant answers. And I wasn't sure I was ready for them. The morning I walked out of prison, the sky looked unfamiliar. Too wide, too bright, too careless. I had dreamt of freedom for 22 years, but when it finally came, the air cut through me like a blade. It wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. It was cold, sharp, and indifferent. No one waited for me outside the gates. I stepped into a world that had moved on without me. Cars looked sleeker, people moved faster, and everyone carried devices in their hands I barely recognized. I wasn't the man I once was. My youth had been traded for concrete walls and the stench of bleach. I wandered for hours, past shops and streets I used to know, now unrecognizable. Faces glanced past me with no recognition. To them, I was a stranger. To me, I was a ghost walking through someone else's life. But her shadow was everywhere. Every woman jogging past made my chest tighten. Every laugh behind me turned my head. For 2 decades, I had lived in a coffin built on suspicion. Now outside, I carried that coffin on my back. I had no family left willing to take me in. My parents were gone. Her parents still despised me, convinced I had taken their daughter's life. Friends had scattered, ashamed to be tied to a convicted murderer. I was free, yet utterly alone. That first night I stayed in a halfway house. The bed was softer than my prison cot, but I slept worse. My mind replayed every detail of the rumors, every whisper of her being alive. I saw her in dreams, sometimes smiling, sometimes accusing. When I woke, the question burned hotter. Was she out there? The parole officer handed me pamphlets about work programs, reintegration services, even therapy. None of it mattered. My purpose wasn't to rebuild what was lost. It was to uncover what had been hidden. If she lived, I needed to see her with my own eyes. If she didn't, I needed to prove I had never been the man they said I was. The next morning, I stood on a street corner, watching strangers hurry by. My reflection in a store window startled me. Gray hair, hollow cheeks, eyes that carried decades of disbelief. But behind that reflection was a flicker of resolve. Find her, I whispered to myself. Find the truth. I knew it wouldn't be easy. 22 years had erased trails, silenced voices, buried evidence. But lies, no matter how carefully woven, always leave loose threads. And I intended to pull every last one. As I walked into the city, blending with the crowd, I felt the weight of freedom pressing down heavier than any prison gate. My life had been stolen. Now I would steal back the truth. And if she was alive, hiding in some other state, she would have to look me in the eyes one last time. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. The kind of day when the city buzzed with life and I felt most invisible. I had just stepped out of a coffee shop, clutching the bitter drink I could barely afford, when my eyes landed on a figure across the street. At first I thought my mind was playing its usual cruel tricks. Hallucinations had become second nature after years of staring at prison walls. But this time was different. She was there. Her hair was shorter, darker than I remembered. But the tilt of her chin, the way her hand brushed strands behind her ear, it was her. My wife, the woman I was convicted of killing. I froze mid-step, my coffee trembling in my hand. Then I saw the man beside her, tall, clean-shaven, wearing the casual confidence of someone who'd never known true hardship. He slipped his arm around her waist as if he had every right to, and she let him. She leaned into him, laughing. Then came the final blow. 2 children bounded toward them, giggling, tugging at her hands. She bent down, kissed one on the forehead, and lifted the other effortlessly. My breath left me in shards. For 22 years I had lived with the weight of her death pressing against my chest. 22 years branded as a murderer. And here she was, alive, radiant, building a life on the grave of mine. Rage surged, burning hot, colliding with disbelief and heartbreak. How could she do this? Why vanish? Why let me rot in prison? Why let the world spit on my name while she built a family? I stumbled forward, nearly stepping into traffic. Horns blared, but I didn't care. I had to get closer. I had to be sure. My eyes locked on her face, drinking in every feature. There was no mistake. Memories assaulted me. The warmth of her hand in mine at our wedding, her whispered promises in the dark, the morning jog that became my life sentence. And now the truth glared at me with merciless clarity. She hadn't died. She had disappeared. She glanced across the street, and for a heartbeat I thought her eyes met mine. My stomach lurched, but she looked away without a flicker of recognition. As if I were just another stranger in the crowd, I wanted to scream her name, to tear through the people between us, to demand answers. But my legs wouldn't move. My throat clenched. I was a man out of time, a ghost staring at the life that had replaced him. The family turned the corner, vanishing from sight. I stood rooted on the sidewalk, heart hammering, mind unraveling. The question roared inside me, louder than any prison guard's command, harsher than any judge's sentence. Why? Why had she done this to me? And as the echo of her laughter faded, I knew one thing with terrifying certainty. My search for truth had only just begun. I couldn't let it go. After seeing her in the street, I spent nights replaying the moment in my mind, her laughter echoing like a cruel reminder of everything I'd lost. My feet carried me back to that part of town again and again, driven by an obsession I couldn't control. It didn't take long to find her. She lived in a pristine suburban neighborhood, where every lawn was trimmed to perfection, and every driveway gleamed with late-model cars. I watched from the shadows as she carried groceries into a house that looked plucked from a magazine. Her children tumbled out of the car, their backpacks bouncing, while the man, her new husband, kissed her cheek before mowing the lawn. It should have been ordinary, but to me it was a knife twisting deeper with every glance. I stayed hidden, moving from one vantage point to another, piecing together the life she had built. Birthday balloons tied to the mailbox, soccer practices, family dinners framed by glowing windows. She looked happy. She looked free. And I looked like a man who'd been erased. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the memory of how she had always controlled me. I began to remember things I'd buried under years of silence. Her subtle manipulations, the way she'd twist arguments until I questioned my own sanity. She would cry at just the right moment, convincing me I was the cruel one. She'd smile sweetly in public, only to freeze me out in private until I begged for forgiveness I didn't owe. Gaslighting. I didn't know the word back then, but now it pulsed through me with every recollection. She hadn't just disappeared, she'd set the stage. She'd planted the seeds of doubt, whispered the lies, orchestrated my downfall long before she vanished. And yet, part of me still loved her. That was the sickest truth of all. I couldn't decide what to do. One moment I fantasized about storming up to the door, demanding she face me, demanding she explain why I had wasted 22 years in a cell. The next I imagined telling the police, the media, anyone who would listen, forcing her to admit the truth. But then I'd see the children, innocent, oblivious, calling her mom, and I'd falter. Did they deserve to have their lives shattered by my vengeance? I stood in the shadows of her perfect new world, torn apart by rage, grief, and a twisted longing. Every night I returned. Every night I convinced myself tomorrow I would act, but tomorrow never came. Not yet. Because first, I needed to understand how deep her betrayal ran, and why she had chosen me as the sacrifice. And so, I kept watching, waiting, gathering fragments of the life she stole from me, knowing the confrontation was inevitable. I told myself I would wait, that I would gather proof, that I would be careful. But obsession doesn't wait. One night, after weeks of circling her new life like a starving wolf, I finally acted. She was walking alone, carrying a bag of groceries, when I stepped out of the shadows. Her face drained of color the instant our eyes met. For a moment, we just stood there, the silence louder than any words. "Hello, Emily," I said, my voice low, trembling with 22 years of rage. The bag slipped from her hands, apples rolling across the pavement. "You," she whispered, backing away. "You're supposed to be dead." I cut her off. "No, just buried alive." Her chest rose and fell sharply, but then something changed. The fear in her eyes hardened into calculation. She straightened her shoulders, as if reclaiming the control she'd always wielded. "You shouldn't have come," she said coldly. "I spent half my life in a cage for your murder," I spat. "You let them chain me, brand me a killer while you built this fantasy. Why?" Her lips curled into a smirk that twisted my gut. "Because you were never more than a stepping stone. Do you really think I loved you? You were convenient, steady, predictable, easy to manipulate." Her words hit harder than any prison fight. "You framed me," I said, the realization solidifying. "The blood in the garage, the staged arguments. It was all you," she laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Of course it was me. I left the clues. I whispered to neighbors. I made sure suspicion pointed straight at you. And it worked beautifully," my fists clenched. "I rotted for 22 years. Do you even care?" Her eyes flashed with something like amusement. "Care you were useful. That's all. I wanted out and you gave me the perfect exit. A dead wife, a guilty husband, a clean slate for me. Look at me now." She gestured toward the quiet houses, the life she had stolen. Free, happy, untouchable. I stepped closer, voice breaking. "You destroyed me. You destroyed yourself," she snapped. "You were weak. That's why it was so easy." Her words carved into me like blades, every syllable a reminder of the years I'd lost. I had dreamed of this moment, of her remorse, her tears. Instead, I was face to face with the truth. She had no remorse. She never loved me, and yet as she turned her back to walk away, a strange calm settled over me. She believed she was untouchable. That arrogance would be her mistake. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of my justice. Her words haunted me long after she walked away. "You were never more than a stepping stone." They rang in my ears like a curse, echoing through every sleepless night. I thought freedom would feel like salvation, but now it felt like a sentence of its own, because I had a choice to make: justice or revenge. I sat on a park bench across from her neighborhood, watching the glow of her living room through the trees. Inside, I saw shadows moving, her children laughing, her husband wrapping his arms around her. From this distance, she was the perfect mother, the perfect wife. And I was the ghost, the intruder, the man erased from history. My mind warred with itself. Part of me wanted to storm into a police station, throw down my story, demand an investigation. I could expose her lies, the staged evidence, the disappearance, the whispers that had followed me in prison. Maybe someone would listen. Maybe someone would believe me this time. But another part of me whispered darker things. Why should I beg for justice from the same system that buried me alive? Why should I gamble with doubt and disbelief when revenge would be swift, final, undeniable? I imagined walking into that house, seeing her eyes widen as she realized her perfect life was over. I imagined her husband learning the truth, her children hearing who their mother really was. I imagined the power of ending her story the way she had ended mine. And then I imagined the cuffs closing on my wrists again. The trial, the whispers, the same cold cell. Would anyone ever believe I was the victim, not the monster? The question strangled me, I stood pacing the shadows, torn apart by the weight of it. For 22 years, every breath I took was dictated by her lie. Every second I lived was proof of her betrayal. Now the world was mine to reclaim, but at what cost? A siren wailed faintly in the distance. My heart pounded as if fate itself were warning me. My hands shook. Sweat dripped down my spine. Justice or revenge? I took a step forward, then another. My footsteps echoed on the empty street, too loud, too final. I could still walk into the station. I could still vanish into the dark. I could still choose. The sirens grew louder, closer. Blue lights flickered at the edge of the night. My breath caught and I realized the story wasn't finished. Not yet. I kept walking, swallowed by the shadows, my decision buried somewhere between the rage in my chest and the hope that maybe, somehow truth still mattered. Behind me, the sirens screamed. Ahead, silence waited, and the world would never know which path I chose.